bem-vindos. Meu nome é Júlia Dias Leite, eu sou a diretora executiva do CEBRI. Esse é um evento do CEBRI em parceria com a Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso, a Casa das Garças e o CDPP. I'm going to now pass to English. This debate will be conducted in English. I'll forward now to Sergio Fausto to do a welcome remarks and Pedro Malan to introduce our speaker today. Welcome, everyone. Sergio.
Oh, it's very, very short welcoming remarks. It's an honor and a pleasure, Raghu, to have you here, although not in person. We're still looking forward to have you down here in Brazil. So after the pandemic, we are really keen on having you here in person. But now we're really glad to have you on the screen and to have the opportunity to listen to you and to ask questions to you. I'm sure it will be a very interesting 60-minute, 70-minute conversation. So now I turn it to Pedro Malan because he will introduce Raghu. Pedro, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Raghu, it's a pleasure being here with you on the screen to see and listen to you. You have a legion of admirers and people who know you personally. Some of them are going to pose questions, I'm sure. I was asked to do two things. First of all, to make an introduction. So you have an outstanding career, so I'll try to speak fast. And say a word about your last two books, the Fault Lines and the recent one in 2019 about the third pillar. How markets and society, markets, states, and communities should rebalance, which is your key point. On Raghuram's career, it's an outstanding academic career. He's a PhD from MIT. The same year, he was hired as an assistant professor of finance at Chicago University, Booth School of Business. He got tenure there in 1995. In 2003, Raghu received the inaugural prize, a very reputable prize of Fisher Black for the best work conducted by a young economist before the age of 40. At the age of 40 as well, Raghu became the chief economist and head of research of the International Monetary Fund. Again, it was the youngest and the first one for the developing world to have occupied that position. In 2005, he was one of the first economists in the world in a conference with the high finance, public at Jackson Hole, organized by the Fed. He was one of the first to draw attention to the very high level of risk and leverage that the world was incurring, especially the developed world. In 2006, he left the fund, went back to the University of Chicago. And from 2013 to 2016, Raghu was governor of the Central Bank of India, a country which has been related. In a question I'm going to pose later on, I ask you to say something about his experience in India prior to become Central Bank governor. While Central Bank governor, Raghu received the Central Banker of the Year award from Euromoney, and he was vice chairman of the Bank for International Settlements in 2016. In 2010, in 2010, he produced a book, which is this Fault Lines, how hidden fractures are still threatening the world economy, which is an outstanding book. And this is translated into Portuguese as linhas de falha, como rachaduras ocultas ainda ameaçam a economia mundial. It's an outstanding book with a preface to the Brazilian edition and with a new introduction to the book. And I hope that the same thing would happen with the book that we are discussing today, which is this, the third pillar, how markets and a state leave the community behind. Is extremely relevant in my mind to our current discussion in Brazil and many other countries, especially after the pandemic. I think that the arguments that Raghu developed in this book about the need for rebalancing of the relationship between the state, defined as the political government structure of a country, is executive, legislative, and judiciary, its markets. Everybody knows what the markets are, where the production and exchange take place in several markets. and the community, which he defines in a very relevant way, I think, for discussions of people who think that society is the weakest link as we have evolved over the last several years, and there's a desperate need for rebalancing now. I should have mentioned at the very beginning, because Raghu, I was saying, well, he's a professor of finance at the University of Chicago, but he has a more important title. He's no less than the Catherine Duzak Miller Distinguished Service Professor of Finance at the University of Chicago and the Chicago Booth School. So Raghu, I wonder whether in your introductory remarks, we continue the discussion, you could tell us how you get involved in this book. And you have somewhere in the beginning, you have a very forceful statement when you ask the question, why did I wrote this book? And you said, and I'm quoting you, in my adult life, I have never been more concerned about the direction our leaders are taking us as I am today. So many people, hearts and minds and nerves and concerns share this perception. I wonder whether you could explain to them, instead of me trying to explain to them how it is a fundamental concern, how you moved from the hidden faults threatening the world economy. Many of them you have anticipated prior to your recent book, and how you came to this book, and what are the key elements you want to bring to the attention of a Brazilian audience. You have the floor, not the floor, you have the screen and the microphone, Raghu. It's always a pleasure to listen to you.
Thank you, Pedro, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Sergio. Thanks for having me here and enabling me to talk to this audience. You asked me where this comes from. Well, it's been a fair amount of time looking at some of the forces which are defining our world today, and thinking about, as you said, the fault lines that are emerging. And of course, my book, The Third Pillar, was written before coronavirus pandemic hit us. But in some ways, the fault lines that have been unearthed by the pandemic are the very fault lines we've had before, and which resulted in part in the global financial crisis, as well as the political crisis that has emerged for the global order since. So let me go back a little bit to talk about where these ideas come from. People have, when they look at a University of Chicago professor, they have in mind some kind of an extreme right-wing markets person. The reality is the University of Chicago is like all great universities, a big tent. And there are lots, if it was a religion, it would be really problematic, because religions, once you make certain ideas a religion, they don't progress. Instead, I think Chicago is largely about challenging the past ideas, which is why associating a set of ideas with Chicago as a set of unchanging ideas is probably problematic. And if you come to Chicago today, you will find in the same sort of building, Dick Taylor, who's a person who likes talking about behavioral finance and market inefficiencies, who's just one floor above Gene Farmer, who believes in extreme market efficiency and in competitive financial markets and extreme rationality. And both those guys go out and play golf together. So it's really about the debate for ideas, and all kinds of personalities and all kinds of views are there. So the view I come with is the sense that markets are generally a good thing, and the freer they are, the better. And of course, there has to be a balance between governments and markets. The governments to enforce contracts, property rights, but also create a safety net. That balance has built over a long period of time. But what I think has changed over the last few decades is that the third pillar, the role of the community, has weakened. And this is a big concern because both directly and through democracy, it makes capitalism work for the many. And when capitalism works for the many support capitalism. I think the post-World War balance between the three pillars, the market, the state, and the community, resulted in fairly stable as well as prosperous liberal market democracies in industrial countries. And to some extent, many of us in emerging markets were trying to push our countries towards that ideal balance, with the idea that it would be the secret of prosperity. It would take us out of the boom and bust cycle. It would take us out of the poverty trap that many of us were in. This has not happened as much as we would desire, though emerging markets have come some way. But in the meantime, primarily through the course of this century, developed countries have seen a fair amount of disillusionment with this model. And there have been increasing fault lines in these countries. I have argued in my earlier book, Fault Lines, that this is what was partly responsible for the global financial crisis, but it is also responsible to some extent for the political crisis we see today. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is talk a little bit about the sort of framework in this book and why it is breaking down. Now, and I want to argue that the big change that has happened in the last decade or so is technological change of a kind we haven't seen before, at least recently. This change has facilitated trade. For example, global supply chains emerged as a result of the information and communications technology revolution. It enabled us to produce in the Philippines, have a factory there while supplying to Mexico, which then supplied further into the United States. So long global supply chains could be managed with both the reduction in trading costs as well as the expansion or the facilitation of communication. Now, this certainly benefited emerging markets who could export for growth, but it also benefited industrial countries, but unevenly. Those who it benefited, people like me who teach in a global university, which has global reach, which has students from all over the world, basically people in service industries with good education, working in the urban hubs, those people benefited. And those people are benefiting even today during the coronavirus epidemic because we can hold sort of conferences like this or meetings like this. Our jobs are largely unimpeded by the pandemic. On the other hand, the technological change hit very strongly the manufacturing hubs, and especially strongly these small towns which had one large big manufacturer who got hit by manufacturing shifting to emerging markets and developing countries. What this did in general was resulted in the loss of well-paying jobs which went to lower middle-class workers, especially those who had a moderate education, basically who had a high school education. But this didn't just stop with manufacturing, it also continued into services. There's been an automation of a variety of service jobs, again, for those who have moderate education. For example, a large sort of job for many people was being a clerk in an insurance company, dealing with all the forms, the applications that came in, and much of that has been automated. So what the ICT revolution has done for the job market is it's hollowed out the middle income jobs, created many more jobs at the top end, which pay very high salaries, and many, many more jobs at the bottom end, which don't pay very much. And this inequality in many ways has been a result of technological change. It's also created some of the problems people are recognizing that we see macroeconomically. For example, some people attribute the stagnant demand as well as the secular stagnation that Larry Summers has talked about to the growing inequality, which has reduced the purchasing power of those who can consume significant amounts out of their income, the poorer segments of society, while giving more to the very rich who consume a much lower fraction. And as a result, aggregate demand itself may have been disrupted. So technological change has created inequality. It's creating inequality not just of jobs and incomes, but also of place. Some of the worst hit communities are those small towns, whether they're outside Paris in the suburbs or further away, or whether they're in the Midwest, a few hundred miles from where I live. There are no jobs to be had because manufacturing has gotten crushed and nothing has come in its place. So spatial inequality has also increased, even while cities like New York, San Francisco, or Sao Paulo are doing very well. The second thing that the ICT revolution has done is change the state. Because the first thing I said was it has changed the markets, it's changed the nature of jobs, it's created a global market, which has created global competition. At the same time, it has also created demands for the state to move from being very, very local or national to becoming international. Corporations like to see the same rules applied wherever they go. So they want harmonization. This, for example, is a big factor in the European Union, where the Union tries to ensure that rules are harmonized across the European Union. The same rules govern department stores or banks wherever you go. That makes it easier for corporations to cross borders. But this attempt to elevate the rules governing local areas creates a number of contradictions or conflicts. For one, it disempowers the local. Too many of the powers have moved from the local to the national and from the national to the international. You think about what Brexit was about. Brexit was the voice of British people saying, take back control. We don't like to see power going from our local communities to London, and even less to see power going from London to the European Union. We want our powers back. And that was, in a sense, the cry behind Brexit. It is a cry that is heard more often across the world. We don't like our rules being determined elsewhere. So one of the effects of the ICT revolution is the integration of markets. The second effect is getting the state more empowered, but the state not just at the national level, but at the international level. And that makes people more uncomfortable with what is happening. They want to take back control. The third effect, partly as a result of these two, is disruptions in communities. What is interesting in the, for example, the 2016 election in which Trump was elected, was how much there was a division between the strong urban areas where jobs were plentiful and the in-between areas, the so-called flyover states, where jobs were really much weaker, the job market, but also where, in addition to economic despair, social disintegration had set in. So in these communities where the largest employer had left, what you saw very soon was effects on marriage. Marriage rates started falling, divorce rates started picking up, the families started breaking down, alcoholism and drug abuse increased. There's a wonderful book by Ann Case and Angus Deaton, which looks at the death rates in the United States and finds that the one community which had a significantly higher relative death rate was the white American. Hitherto, the most privileged community was now suffering deaths of despair, largely because the local community was breaking down. Local institutions like schools, which are in many ways the pathway to success in this new economy, those two were breaking down. Now, even while the community is breaking down, the importance of community institutions has increased. think again of what I just said. Schooling is very important. A high school degree is not enough. You need a university degree, that to a good university degree in order to get a good job. But instead, what is happening is in these communities, the people who have the opportunity, the choice set, the people who are doing well, as they see the community break down, leave the community. They go elsewhere. They go to the coastal cities where jobs are more plentiful. And in the meantime, the community gets poorer and poorer in terms of human capital. Good people have left. And as a result, the community is not able to help those left behind. And their only, in a sense, source of action is a political one, which is why they raise their voice and they vote the way they did, whether they're in Northern England in the Brexit vote or they're in the Midwest in the Trump vote in 2016. So the community has weakened. It's been differentially hit by global forces. It has been disempowered by the steady movement of powers to the national and then international level. And it is disintegrating because in this environment where good schooling is so important for opportunity, families are leaving, taking their children with them in search for opportunity in other places which are better for their kids. The importance of place has become much stronger in this world. Community is important, but it is not helping in the way it should. So what responses have governments come up with? And I'll stop just after this. Basically, it has either been neglect or it has been about centralized solutions. Neglect, well, those are places we don't see. We don't worry about those places that are being left behind. A few miles, I can look out of my window and see the ghettos on the south side in Chicago. Those are places with very high unemployment, very high crime rates. But so long as they don't intrude onto the rest of Chicago, there's a tendency to neglect them. And similarly, centralized solutions are often attempted. For example, in the United States, we are currently trying to move economic activity to places that have been left behind through what are called place-based tax incentives. If you open a factory there, you get some tax benefits. The problem is these things are always conceived in the center, don't necessarily target the problems of the local community, and often are not the right answer for what the community needs. For example, think about Amazon, which wanted to put its second office in Long Island City in Queens, New York. And this was the kind of investment many cities would kill for. But the Long Island County basically said, no, we don't want them. And that was an interesting rejection because it would have brought a lot of investment, a lot of jobs, but they weren't necessarily the kinds of jobs that the community could benefit from. They were jobs for highly skilled programmers, highly skilled managers, and that community didn't have the ability to take advantage of those jobs. And in fact, many in the community might have instead seen that local property rents would go up, there would be less place in the schools, they would have more problems than necessarily solutions. So centralized answers aren't particularly effective. Instead, we need to find more local answers. Otherwise, what we will have is the kind of populist revolt that we're seeing across the world. And there is some rationale to this populist revolt because it blames the center for misguided policies. And unfortunately, the populist leaders are trying to substitute one sort of problem with another instead of trying to foster localism and foster local solutions. They instead propose some kind of a nationalism as a solution where the national community displaces the local community. I think populist leaders ask the right questions, but I think they offer the wrong answers. Instead, I would advocate a bottom-up approach, what I call inclusive localism, and I'm happy to talk about it as we enter the panel discussion. The broader point I want to argue is, I think trade is important. I think globalization is important. It benefits both the emerging markets as well as the developing countries, as well as the rich countries. But we need to find a new framework in which we enable this kind of globalization while preserving the localism, the local empowerment, the local differences, which make us unique, but also make us feel as if we have a place in the world. And that new combination is really what I'm striving for in this book. The book talks about the history of capitalism, how the community played a role, as well as how it broke down. But ultimately, the hope is that it provides a framework to think about this and a framework for change. Let me stop there.
I think, Sergio, would you like to make the first question?
You are mute. Take your mute.
You are on mute, Sergio. Put the audio.
Well, Pedro Malan was supposed to ask the first question, but since he has vanished in the thin air,
I'll be delighted. I'll be delighted to do it.
Okay, go ahead. But
you have to return with your screen, I think, with your video.
Your camera is off, Pedro.
Okay, just a moment.
Pedro, maybe.
Yeah, go for your question. That's a problem.
All right, I'll go first. Raghu, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation.
I managed.
Okay,
I managed.
Just in time. Okay, go ahead, Pedro.
I'm sorry, Raghu. I appreciate very much if you could probe deeper on this question of the emergence of populism. You have in your book the differences between how it emerged in the US, in the UK, but in the context of the, say, that brings the question, why is your book is so important in my mind for the discussion here in Brazil now? I'll give you one information. This year, before the end of the year, we are going to elect 5,570 mayors and 65,000 local assemblymen or women. It's a major important, especially for your arguments in this. And I wonder whether you care to comment about the importance when you say about a more local action, how critical it is for you on the basis, even your experience in India, of having local action by having people, especially the young at heart, especially those who have a vocation for being involved either in the legislative work at the local level or in the executive work at the local level, to be involved. I remember there's a very good book by Mark Lilla on the Once and Future Liberal. At some point he said, well, if you really want to change things at the local and then at the state, the provincial level, and then at the national simultaneously, you have to get involved in some, trying to have some leverage on the way decisions are made locally, at the provincial and state level and nationally. And he has a very nice chapter, a section in the book. He say, we need more mayors, not marchers, demonstrating and things like demonstrate. How would you think about that, considering your experience in India and what you know from the US? And is there any hope of this getting the new generations more involved in local community level action in this having involvement in the executive and legislative areas?
Well, the great question. And let me start first with the populism. I mean, as you know, populism broadly defined is a rejection of the elite, right? The elite are corrupt, the elite are far away, the elite don't understand us. And it emphasizes the will of the people as the primary driving force, the legitimacy that comes from that. So, so long as I'm elected, I have all the legitimacy I need, regardless of what the laws of the land are in the Constitution and so on. But there are obviously various kinds of populism, whether it is the left-wing populism that we associate with radical Marxism and so on, or it is the right-wing populism, which we associate with populist nationalism. And what populist nationalism does in particular is, in my view, give more of a sense of you belong to the national community, even though your local community is breaking down. Even though you feel disempowered locally, you're part of this national awareness. And for that, it is quite important that the national community have people outside it, because you don't have a sense of community if everybody is in it. So you have to find others. In the US, for example, it might be people who are minorities, people who are foreigners, sometimes people who are the wrong gender. Those are the others outside this group that is of insiders, the national community. And I think, this is something that people from Hannah Arendt have commented upon, which is this can be very damaging because it's not actually a strong community. It's a very amorphous community. It's more an intellectual idea of a community rather than a real community. But the problem with that is that the enemies have to continue being reinvented every few years to keep that national community together. And so it moves from one set of enemies to another, but eventually the only enemies are outside, and it can become a source for militant nationalism. So that is the worry about the path this takes. On the flip side, I think it does point to a very real search for community, and it tends to enthuse people who don't have that sense of community locally. It gives them a sense of belonging, which they didn't have. And I would say the antidote, therefore, is to try and emphasize more the sense of belonging locally without that sense of belonging becoming a source of exclusiveness again. And that's a danger we have to recognize, that you don't want to translate the exclusion at the national level to exclusion at the local level. And I think you're absolutely right. If the way you do this is by giving people more of a stake, a sense that they can influence things locally, even in small ways. I can influence the way rubbish is collected in my community. I can influence the way certain public resources are used. Create a park here, create a playground there. If in addition, the center supports the local community with additional funds, that gives me an ability to raise its capabilities. And it also gives me more interest in who represents me locally. So I don't sort of say, it doesn't matter, they have no power anyway. I take more interest. So there is a virtuous circle which can build up. So I'm with you entirely that if we have more local empowerment, that helps. Now you talked about India. India, Gandhi's view in post the freedom struggle was in fact to strengthen the village community. He said India lives in its villages, we need to strengthen that. The counter to Gandhi was Nehru, who was almost ironically Gandhi's disciple, but broke with Gandhi on this issue. He wanted a much stronger state, much stronger industrialization, and much stronger cities, urbanization. And to that extent, he saw the Soviet Union model as the right one. And so India went that way. It was only in 1989 that we had a constitutional amendment to increase the power of local bodies. And that has moved some, but the regional governments as well as the national government were already really strong and resisted giving power. India needs to move more in this direction, and I hope it will happen.
Can I ask my question now?
Yeah.
Raghu, let me be provocative for a minute here. Let me bring Karl Marx to the fore and to the discussion. He famously said, all that is solid melts into air. He was describing the Industrial Revolution and the dissolution of traditional community bonds. My question is the following. Is this advocacy of strong communities compatible with the advocacy at the same time of globalism and free markets. Isn't there an inherent contradiction between the two? Untrammeled global capitalism on the one hand, strong communities on the other. The only, if history is any guide, looking at the history of capitalism, strong communities have been somewhat kept in a better place where the state was stronger to curb creative destruction and regulate the free market. I want to, what do you make of that provocation?
I think that's an important question. It is, in a sense, the central tension, right, in the community, which is there is a feeling that the community is largely about tradition, about bonds that are hard to break. The community limits choice, and therefore it's the antithesis of the market. The market is about, you're my friend today, you're my competitor tomorrow. And bonds keep breaking all the time. Choice is important. Choice is the enemy of bonds and long-term relationships. And I've even written papers on this. So it is a tension. And of course, the added tension I point to in this book is markets like common government. And common government means that uniform government across the entire territory that the markets operate in. And as markets expand, that territory becomes really much larger, which then diffuses the power of the community, which is much more local from saying anything. So it's a very good question. What do you do about this tension? And the answer, to my mind, is actually two or threefold. One, politics or the political structures have always been something separate from the market. And in many ways, democracy gives people power that they don't really enjoy in the marketplace. One man, one vote, regardless of how much you earn. And it has no bearing with what your economic power is, at least theoretically. We know obviously money does matter. But it's an attempt to diffuse the power of the market. And I think what we need to recognize is that as markets become bigger, we need some ways to, in fact, empower people that don't depend on their market power. And that's democratic power. And that's why I keep saying we need to push more power down to the locality. But I think there are two other factors. One is markets create volatility. And if markets they're not all powerful. They depend on the tolerance of people. If markets create too much volatility, people turn off the markets and want to close them down. I mean, a period like this is a period of great danger for markets because of the volatility that has been created. And as a result, people welcome safety nets, which protect them against the volatility of the market. And one important source of safety net is the community. I mean, you can see, I'll give you an example from India. Migrants who left their community to work in the big cities have been leaving those cities in a huge way, even after the lockdown, going back to their village because that's the only place they will be accepted without questions. And they have a safety net. The government has no safety net for them. They're going back to the community where they have a safety net. So the second thing is markets create volatility. The community is the antithesis of volatility. And again, that's a benefit. The third thing I would say is technology, that surprising as it may seem, I think technology also facilitates community in a way that didn't happen before. And, we know the usual, we can maintain more contact through social media. We now can have a conference across various countries like we're having right now. But I would say something else is also very interesting, that, this pandemic has created the possibility of distributed economic work, right? At least in some of the professions we have. We are seeing increasingly that telemedicine is possible. You can be a doctor and offer advice, and this pandemic has forced more doctors to do that. But you can teach across the internet. You can do much of the work that consultants do across online. So my hope is that we start being able to distribute economic activity more by place, and that we don't all have to congregate in Sao Paulo or in New York in order to do that activity. In fact, people leave those crowded cities because of fear of some of the events like the ones we're going through. But that helps distribute economic activity through the country and helps more equality of place.
Pedro, your mic,
I think Ilan had a question, right?
Yeah, I have a question from Ilan. Can I make the question now, Pedro? Or
yes, of course. Ilan always has precedence over me.
Okay. Professor Raghu, I have a question from Ilan Goldfein, one of the director of CDPP. How should countries with large part of the population living in poverty that makes isolation quite challenging, but also quite low hospital resources, should face COVID-19? What would you recommend? And what are the fiscal priorities under COVID-19? And what is the whole of the monetary policy?
Well, I think we have to be cleverer. That's the answer to my mind, because you don't have the same level of hospital facilities. You don't have the ability to distance as easily. And so you have to try and do things a little differently. Now, it's very hard to deal with the problem of distancing when you're living, 5, 7, 8 people to a room, as in some places in India, and I presume in some places in Brazil, far fewer, I hope. But at the same time, as far as medical facilities go, it is probably more useful to try and see what is really absolutely necessary and what is the hierarchy I can use. So for example, is it possible to use paramedics to deal with much of the medical issues, escalating an issue up only if it is more serious and beyond the capabilities of the paramedic? And can we use more time of the scarce time of doctors in a more structured way once the capabilities of the paramedics get exhausted? As far as resources go, for example, one of the biggest concerns in industrial countries has been ICU units and to some extent ventilators. And of course, these are in far shorter supply in emerging markets and developing countries. But the reality is only a small fraction of the patients require this. And certainly the experience with ventilators, as I understand it, is by the time you require it, it's almost always too late. So could we instead focus on intermediate steps, which would save many more people? For instance, oxygen devices that enable your intake of oxygen, but aren't as intrusive as, say, the ventilator. There are oxygenation devices which are much cheaper, much more readily available, and that would have a much bigger effect on saving a large number of the population from having to go into more advanced medical care, which would require the ICU unit and the ventilator. So can we be clever about that? Similarly, as far as testing goes, because testing capabilities also fall behind, can we do more mass testing in a way that optimizes the use of our resources? And so only if we detect within maybe 100 samples some evidence of the virus do we go and probe deeper. Otherwise, we move on. So, I mean, there are ways of being cleverer, and I think we have to use every which way of being cleverer. The international community has been so far somewhat behind, even perhaps not acting in the best interests of poorer countries. For example, there has been talk about aid being given so long as it is not used to buy medical supplies that would otherwise go to industrial countries. That seems to me very short-sighted, because unless we stop the pandemic everywhere. We can't stop it truly anywhere. So I think we need to spend more resources on this, especially for countries that don't have it. But even for countries that do have it, we need to do a cleverer job of using whatever resources we have, because we can't augment those resources tremendously, but do it in a more clever way. I think that's possible.
There was a second part in Ilan's question.
Sorry, I lost that. Could you remind me?
About a role of monetary and fiscal policy.
Oh, yeah. I think the initial role of fiscal policy is just to spend what it takes to stop the virus. That is not a huge increase in resources, except for some fairly poor countries, developing countries in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. But that seems to me a no-brainer. That's what we need to do. Beyond that, I think protecting people's lives, ensuring they have enough to eat, to places to live, as well as protecting valuable entities that have lost access to financial markets. And what I mean by this differs from country to country. And by this, I don't mean that every sort of small firm needs to be saved, because many small firms aren't particularly profit-making. And also, if they do break down, can be put together later at relatively low cost. What is important is to help the people who work for those firms through unemployment insurance and so on. But it's not necessary to keep those firms alive for the year or so that it takes us perhaps to start a serious process of recovery in some industries. Some industries, of course, will start up quite quickly after we have some success in the battle against the virus. But what I think countries need to do is conserve their fiscal resources for helping valuable firms that would not survive this whole process and would be hard to revive if they collapsed. And so we have to be clever again in our use of fiscal resources. I think on the monetary side, clearly inflation, the longer this pandemic lasts, the less inflation is the bigger worry. In fact, disinflation is going to be more rampant. Eventually, inflation may be a worry, but it's not a short-term worry. And I think the more important concern for the monetary authorities is really to make sure that the flow of credit is reasonable, and sometimes to ensure that government markets are also not disrupted, that the government can raise whatever resources it needs in the short run. So I would say, with the idea of breaking rules temporarily, closer cooperation between monetary and fiscal over this time is okay. But I would rather not break any of the institutional constraints that work well in the long run unless absolutely needed to effect that cooperation. So for example, some people say, let's throw away inflation targeting. No, that serves us well. And that gives a signal that once the pandemic is over, we're not going to tolerate runaway inflation. And that gives some confidence to investors. So some cooperation, I think, is still useful.
Could I go now? Julia?
You can go. Pedro,
Yeah.
I think
Your time?
you go now.
Yeah.
But then I think Julia should ask the questions that we are receiving from the public. There are many and they're good. So
Okay.
Go ahead first.
No, I'll be very brief then. I think Ilan posed two very important questions, and I like your replies. Just to follow up on them, linked to your concern in your book, Third Pillar, with something that you see that is been reduced recently over the several years in both developed and in some developing countries, just trust in government and the ability of the technical experts in make convincing explanations to the wider population about why certain actions are required. The experience so far with fighting the virus, the pandemic, has shown that the countries have fared better, where the countries in which, first of all, what you're absolutely correct, have a concern about spreading the dissemination of the contagion, the speed of the contagion, and exponential contagion of the virus to the capabilities of the health systems, public and private. And I don't want to name here, except for two which has been named recently. They have done very well recently. One is Vietnam, and the other one is the state of Kerala in India, which apparently have done very well by being early in the game, anticipating things, taking measures, and thereby managing to have this reduction, the cost, social, human, death cost of the. So I entirely agree with you. But I want where do you call, doesn't need to be now. Let's listen to the other questions. But I'd like to come back to this question of the erosion of trust that the national populists could generate by their simplification of issues and by the attempt to avoid going deeper in certain areas. And coronavirus is one example of that, that a lot of damage has been made by some people who try to simplify too much the issues at stake without making a clear, cohesive, coherent response to the virus. But we could come back to this issue of trust in governments that you see to be eroded, especially on technical opinion and expertise later after you have a next round of questions.
Well, can do that.
Okay. I'll go now with the first question from Claudio Fristac, which is one of the members of the board of CEBRI. He has a question about India. Could you expand on the future of democracy of India? The argument used to be run along the following lines. Only democracy can hold India together. Country-wise nationalists or factionalism will tear the country apart. What is your view?
Well, I am an instinctive believer in democracy, and I do think that majoritarianism in India, and there's sort of a chapter in the book on that, is not a good place to go to. We have far too much variety to go towards majoritarianism. And having a disgruntled population of any size, seeing itself as unequal, as second class, is a recipe for long-term political and economic disaster. So I am very much of the view that India needs to be democratic, needs to treat every community equally, and cannot be seen as favoring one versus the other. Now, in some sense, and this goes to Pedro's earlier point, some of the majoritarians have a way of twisting this argument around and trying to say, yeah, we're up for equality. The whole problem is some minority communities have privileged rights and are treated differently. Therefore, we have to eliminate those privileges. And you hear this, across the world. And the reality is, in India, most of the minority communities, with a couple of exceptions, are actually doing much worse economically, and don't experience privileges. Yes, they have their customs that are sometimes protected legally, but the whole idea about having uniform laws across the country probably would be about trying to persuade communities that have potentially archaic laws to alter them, to modernize them, especially, for example, if those laws discriminate against women and so on. So I think there is a way forward which respects each community and respects democracy. And in fact, if you go back to India's constitutional debates around the time that India set up its constitution in the late 1940s, those debates are basically about how India cannot survive if it resurrects the old hatreds and really needs to deal with them and have a more egalitarian structure in its constitution. So short ending answer is yes, absolutely. I think India needs democracy, and temporary deviations from that might happen, but I think in the longer run, India has, it hangs together on that basis.
Okay, I have also a question from Arminio Fraga, also a member of CEBRI. Your views on the not-for-profit sector and subsidies for this sector.
And what was the last part?
And subsidies for the sectors.
Subsidies for that, okay.
Tertiary.
I mean, look, I think that the not-for-profit sector is part of this this third pillar and has become more important over time. Of course, the not-for-profit sector requires some measurement of whether it's delivering as advertised, as well as some ways of control. It can't basically be run at, say, the public expense without answering to anybody or any constituency. One way it has run is based on private donations. And of course, in that process, certain private interests are favored over others. But that's one way it can be run. Another way is with some public support, but then the question is, what kind of NGOs, non-government organizations are favored, while what kinds are refused those donations? And that becomes a political nightmare, especially if every time a new government comes in, it changes priorities completely. So I would say maybe in some cases, some government funding is useful, but I would say better that the government funds local government, and local government is empowered through an election process where the local people have a say and therefore some control over where the funds are spent, and that NGOs fund themselves through the public by getting donations rather than relying primarily on the government for their support.
Okay. Aftermath of the crisis, what will be the role of the international economic cooperation institutions, such as IMF and World Bank, in the funding and helping the reconstruction, and how that may affect the power balance in countries with a large pressure from nationalist movements?
Oh, that's a huge question. You know, it's hard to, I mean, we don't know where this is going to end. I think this goes back to the hope that seems to be there in the markets as we brought down the virus infections in a number of countries to a manageable level, and that it will come down further over the course of the year. And at some point, we will discover that vaccine, and we will transform in a seamless way into a vaccinated population. And so it's all about recovery from now and no bumps. That seems to be the market perception. And my sense is we don't know yet. We could have further bumps. We're seeing some reinfections in South Korea, in China. This could happen in a bigger way in the fall as the temperature turns cold in the industrial countries. You know, so maybe we prepare well, and we can sort of fight any new sort of flare-outs of the pandemic. But I don't think we can be sure. So it depends on how long this lasts. And my worry is that from a public policy perspective, we're treating this as this one goal. So do whatever it takes, and countries are spending 10, 12, 15% of GDP for the next 3-4 months. The US is actually issuing $3 trillion worth of bonds this quarter. 3 trillion, that's 15% of GDP, right? In one quarter. So I mean, those are big numbers. And if this is a prolonged thing, we have to be much more careful about how we spend money, even in industrial countries. Of course, emerging markets so far haven't had that luxury of huge spending because they're already fiscally stressed. But no doubt, if the pandemic lasts, there will be more pressure for them to spend to keep people sort of fed, to keep people in shelter, and so on. So if if the crisis has largely ended over the next month and a half, and then it's all about recovery, it's one story. If it's about repeated crises for some time, it's a different story. And the first looks more like the traditional kind of problems the IMF and the World Bank are there to deal with, which is, they'll have to make more loans to countries in difficulty. They'll have to restructure. Maybe the number out there is 15 to 20% of emerging markets and developing countries will need to restructure their debt over this period. So that's one. That's more traditional. It looks like a wave of defaults, but it's not cataclysmic. If, on the other hand, we are shut down in some form or the other for another year, then I think we're talking about a very different situation. Then we need new institutions, not just the IMF and the World Bank.
Could I?
Pedro, yeah.
Yeah. On following up on this question, Raghu, well, somewhere in your book, you say that one of the reasons why you wrote the book as well is because we are in an increasingly polarized world that risks turning us back on 70 years of widespread peace and prosperity. I must say, an arrangement since the Second World War, which helped China to become the first largest exporter in the world and the second largest importer. So China benefited enormously from this integration between state, a very centralized, effective state, and markets, then the use of the integration to trade and finance and foreign direct investment with the world at large. You seem to be concerned about this polarization that we have observed and the emergence of the populist nationalists to the left and to the right, and this emergence of the domestic politics of fear and anger. Since the IMF was mentioned and you ended up with it, remember at the moment, as we speak, there are at least 100 countries, members of the IMF, who have requested for IMF assistance. Remember, in 2006, 2007, as you draw attention in your 2005 speech, there were only 6 or 7 countries with IMF programs. The only relevant one at the time was Turkey. The vision of many in the world was that the private capital markets are perfectly able to handle the borrowing requirements of developing countries in the world. Now, it's hard to imagine the IMF, with its current resources, handling the demands of more than 100 countries. So something new would have to happen in this area of international cooperation, as in climate change, as in trade, as in fighting the pandemics, as in this international effort for finding a vaccine and medicines to handle that. So there is no hope that every country, for more nationalistic and concerned about getting back control to its own borders, could handle that without some rethink of the types and patterns of international cooperation. Do you agree with that?
Oh, of course, Pedro. Even before the pandemic, as you know, relationships were breaking down internationally. Relations were breaking down.
Yeah.
I would not put the blame only on the United States. No. I would say that China, since 2013, has been increasingly, and even before that, increasingly militaristic and antagonistic. My friend Arvind Subramaniam has a book on the China-US relationship where on the cover is this famous photo of Obama bowing politely before the previous Chinese president. And that photo went around the world as a reflection of the new order where the US was kowtowing to the Chinese emperor, so to speak. And neither the version where the US is kowtowing to China or the feeling in China that they're trying to redress the unequal treaties that happened after the Opium War, neither of those is a good symbolism for the future. What we need is really cooperation between the United States and China on the basis of mutual respect. And that requires actions on both sides. I think it is unfair probably to associate this tension primarily with President Trump. I think it is something that has been brewing, and it is something that will stay even if the administration changes and we have a new Democratic president rather than a Republican president. However, I would say that a lot more could be done about the nature of the dialogue. The dialogue has become totally antagonistic, and it's totally about one-upmanship in the public eye, which doesn't make for good progress on negotiations, as you well know. So it seems to me that the need for a changed global response on so many dimensions, whether it's climate change, whether it's international financing, whether it is trade, we need a different response. We need a better global response, and it is not served by the two largest players being antagonistic towards each other. What can change? Well, I think the greater likelihood of change is leadership in the United States, because it has an election coming. You know, in fact, regardless of what happens in the election, I think we will see some movement. Which direction, I'm not sure. That depends on the nature of the election and who wins.
Okay. I have a question here from Winston Fritz. Do you think that the Fed statement that will be standing by providing liquidity is valid irrespective of the shape and duration of the way out of the sanitary crisis?
I think a central bank's role is to keep markets functioning and to repair markets when they break down. That's part of the liquidity provision role. I am far more skeptical about trying to alter prices or trying to help specific entities in the market, because that may postpone a necessary restructuring. Give you an example. A number of central banks have said that they will now help entities that have lost their rating, who have fallen from BBB below, the so-called fallen angels. My sense is, if you thought this pandemic was to last for a month and a half, maybe that's okay. That's sort of saying, I don't want further disruption. I don't want a wave of bankruptcies right now. Maybe we just deal with this 1.5 months. But if it's much less certain it's going to be over in a month and a half, it could be a year, it could be a couple of years for some entities, especially, for example, in the cruise ship industry, then I think you need some kind of adjustments. If these are highly levered entities, some of them will have to write down their debts so that they have greater capability of investment when activity resumes. If some of them don't have a viable business, maybe they should close down. A number of restaurants, for example, you know, we're supporting them right now in a number of countries, and that's okay if it was a month or two. But if it is a year and we're not sure at the end of it whether there'll be any demand for the restaurant, it seems like a huge, huge cost for the economy to support, essentially to preserve the economy as if nothing has changed. But in fact, so much has changed, and we may want those changes to happen. So I would say when the central bank intervenes in lending to specific entities, it may be coming in the way of markets. It has to make sure the markets are working, but to try and say, oh, the interest cost for this entity has gone up by 300 basis points, so I should intervene. Well, so long as the market is not in panic, it may be correctly imposing a high cost on that entity because that entity has no future. And it's important that that cost be imposed. So I would say you should intervene some to protect markets, to make them function. For example, when the treasury market went out of sync, that was a good place to intervene. But to say I will support these markets forever is to create a distortion. That's within the country. So there's also distortions across countries. If the Fed is supporting markets in the US, it makes the US far more attractive relative to other countries, and those countries start losing capital because capital flows back to the US. That creates a problem for the other countries.
Okay, another question here from Carlos Braga from IMD. Do you believe that the pandemic will end the belief that social responsibility of business is to increase profit? You know,
I mean, this sort of has the echoes of Milton Friedman's famous 1970 piece. And I think that any dictum sort of gets taken too far. and out of the environment in which it was proposed. And the environment in which Milton Friedman proposed this was where there was no measurability of what the corporations were doing. Anything was justifiable, including profitless growth, which was a tax on society because that was an unviable use of resources. They weren't making any money. There was also arguments in President Johnson's time in the 60s that corporations should hold down prices in order to help the government fight inflation. And Milton Friedman saw this as terribly damaging because he thought that prices were an indicator of shortages and in fact were a way for the economy to address those shortages. And if corporations held down those prices in order to help the government to do their patriotic duty, as was sometimes called at that time, they were actually making it more difficult for the economy and hurting it. So those were good arguments for that time. I think there has been a perversion of those arguments somewhat. At the same time, I would say going the other direction now and saying, there is no limit to the social responsibility of corporations, then opens them up for every political entrepreneur to push his or her agenda. If I believe that you should be working against climate change, I lobby the shareholders and I become an activist outside the company shops in order to try and push you. That seems to me, once you open it up to anything, you could have the opposite. And the reality is we have to find a medium, a golden mean. It's not just about profits, but profits do matter. And it's also about, your role in the community, but again, to a limited extent. To the extent that you can help your employees, obviously it's important to do it. To the extent you can help your suppliers, your customers, obviously that is in long-term interest of the corporation. But, should you build a road because the government is not building a road? No, that's the role of the government. Don't displace the government because there are no checks and balances of the corporation in the activities it does in its role as government. You will rue the day where you put corporations in the role of the government.
Okay, we're running on time now. I will ask the last question, which is connected with your answer now, and then we're going to start the closing. So your views on the green recovery and the Green New Deal's proposals in Europe.
On the Green New Deal?
The Green New Deal.
Yeah.
And the green recovery.
Yeah. Look, I think that it is better to keep these two things a little separate, not entirely separate. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. There will be a tremendous demand for resources, and there will also be a tremendous overhang on demand, especially investment, when the recovery happens. Partly because demand will be very weak, too many people, too many businesses will be in difficulty, too many people will have been in unemployment for a long time, they won't have resources to spend. So the recovery will be difficult. And in that recovery, we do want investment. So it's important not to put more constraints on investment by saying this has to be of this kind or that kind. That said, if new investment is warranted, it's probably wise to make it in a greener way. So to the extent we can create incentives which are shaping investment in that direction, I don't think it's misplaced. It could be part of the stimulus process. But I wouldn't put a whole new set of regulations which curb investment in order to get it to be green. You're putting two objectives. One is recovery, the other is green at the same time, and it may ensure we have neither recovery nor green. So I would say light guidance is fine, but recognize that recovery is really important. And corporations are sensible. If they think that in the longer run, green investment is important, they will try and focus on that, and you can nudge them in that direction. But if they think that some investment they can do without necessarily meeting the green requirement, but that investment will be very important for jobs. I don't think we should rule that out, given that jobs and recovery will be very important.
Thank you, Professor Rajan. I'll pass now to Pedro for your last comment, or Sergio to close. We have a lot of questions here that unfortunately we don't have the time to make it, but I will receive them by email and then do it later.
Pedro.
I could be very brief. No, I will leave Sergio Fausto to make the concluding comment. My very brief comment is the following. Raghu, I would like to thank you very much. I think you have an outstanding performance. I hope that people enjoyed very much, and I should thank you for being with us this afternoon. Sergio will prepare a speech for you now that we'll start to read at the moment. So yeah, nice to see you, and congratulations.
I've written a 1-hour farewell remark, so Fidel Castro style. So Raghu, just a few words. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful conversation. I love the way you addressed complicated things in a not excessively complicated way, always undogmatic. So I'm looking forward to having you down here after the pandemic to resume the conversation. So if I may use a metaphor, I'll leave the table still a little hungry. So we badly need more food for thought. So thank you so much. It's been not only interesting, but it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all. And
thank you all.
Bye.